Thank you for checking out this DeveloperTown Tech Meld presentation. Today, we'll be discussing options for designing cross-platform applications.
Hi, I'm Jake Van Brunt. I've been working at DeveloperTown for about 4.5 years doing mobile development.
My name is Lisa, and I am a designer, a UX designer and visual designer at DeveloperTown, and I've been working here for about 5 years.
We're going to go over Xamarin and React Native and cross-platform in general. Why do we do a cross-platform? Time saving. We want to write once, deploy everywhere. We usually have faster development deployment times. Cost, one code base to maintain is cheaper than two separate native apps. A single development language. Feature and bug fixes are typically easier and faster to do, and we can reach a wider audience very quickly. So how it started. In the beginning, we had these things called hybrid apps. They basically were a combination of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, so forth. Some people have heard of them known as Cordova, Ionic, PhoneGap. Cordova is currently the headway that's still being used around a lot. So some of the pros of hybrid gave us, they were cost effective. They were pretty easy to maintain if you already had an existing web development team because it uses some of the same technical stack. It has one core base for all platforms. Save time for, as long as you stuck to basic design elements that you would see on the web, it was fairly easy to do. It was fairly simple to maintain. The cons, the big thing was performance. Most hybrid apps have a medium performance compared to native applications. Some do require a web connection or to run. There are some things that allow you to do some offline functionality, but it's also hit or miss and it requires a plugin to sometimes do that. You're also limited on native functionality, so typically if you're accessing things outside the typical platform, it requires an additional plugin, and you get plugin dependencies, which can cause conflicts and errors.
So these are just a few examples of hybrid apps that you might know of. So they're a little tricky to find popular ones, but the Amtrak one you can see on the left, they do an okay job, but you can kind of tell that it's a hybrid app just because of all the blockiness and all the components. It looks sort of like a responsive web. And then there's also Untapped, which they do a little bit better job, as you can tell, of card layouts and everything, and making it look like a native mobile experience. When you look at UX, native apps versus hybrid apps, native apps they're a little better generally because they fully utilize the UX language of the mobile OS. So they're integrated with device functionalities, so they can do certain things really well, such as notifications, and those types of things. They're integrated with like the camera really well. The designer has limitless options because of that. So there are really no barriers when you design a native app. Hybrid, on the other hand, has a lot of limitations. When designing hybrid apps, you have to expect a lot of constraints, and it's important to work super closely with the dev team, and more so than normal, just so you can prepare for those blockers. You have to plan a lot of solutions for hybrid pain points. So like I said, notifications, that's something that hybrid apps can't really do. So finding a different way to notify your audience and your user is really important. Leverage user testing, that's always a big thing with UX, but even more heavily so on hybrid.
So large-scale experience. So what usually happens, and usually what we see here at DeveloperTown is a company or a client will come in and say, hey, we built an app with Cordova or Ionic, and they get about a year into development, and they want to add some additional native features to the app, like BLE interactions with Bluetooth, GPS tracking, custom animations, image and video processing. So these are pretty intensive, and most of the time what happens is we're like, well, typically we have to rewrite the whole thing because those limitations are built into some of those hybrid frameworks. There are some libraries out there that do help with some of this, but to get a true functionality and to get to some custom options, it's better to go the native route. So how do we get a cross-platform application with performance of UI and UX native and the development speed of cross and cost of hybrid? So there's two big heroes right now that are emerging in the market. There's a couple other ones, but these are the ones that are being used mostly at the moment. We have Xamarin by Windows currently. They just bought out. And React Native, which is a Facebook framework. Xamarin is a C# based language or base framework, and React Native is a JavaScript based framework. Xamarin is a cross-platform framework that compiles C# code into native assemblies, ARM for iOS, and intermediate language with MonoVM for Android. React Native is a cross-platform framework that renders native UI elements but uses the OS-specific JavaScript language. I know that's JS Core on iOS, much the same as Android. So you get a little bit of there's kind of a hybrid thing in there, sort of, because they're still technically using JavaScript functions underneath, but they're using native UI elements. So some pros on these two. Xamarin and React Native are both open source. Xamarin has close to native performance. React Native still has some decent performance, but you're going to get a little better out of Xamarin. They have one tech stack. Typically, you're looking at all JavaScript and all C#. You both get native UI elements out of it. For Xamarin, you have a fully hardware support. It's easy to maintain. They both have a large community and tools. React Native does have some better interactions with web developers because they're obviously already knowledgeable on the fact of using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. React Native does not require to have native knowledge. It also provides some hot reloading, live updates. It does have some great tooling like Visual Studio Code and Reactotron. What does set Xamarin a little bit apart is it does support Windows Desktop, UWP, Mac, tvOS, iOS, Android, and so forth. Xamarin also provides Forms and Xamarin Native options. Forms is a very quick and easy form apps if you want to build. Xamarin Native basically gives you an option to build a core business library with a Android and iOS front end. There are some tools coming out for React Native to get to Mac and tvOS and UWP, but they are not quite out in full production yet. So some cons. So Xamarin requires some base knowledge of native frameworks. It does basically wrap a lot of the native methods and native properties in C# wrap code, so it looks very similar to what you would write natively. The tooling debugging is not super mature. Visual Studio Mac does not have a lot of the perks that you would see in some other IDEs. You do see some delay in platform support, so they're about maybe a couple weeks behind when there's a release to a new OS. There can be some library compatibility issues, and for both of these, I would say they're not super heavy for UI applications such as augmented reality or virtual reality. React Native is not fully stable. There is still a 0.5 release. There's quite the bug list. I mean, they both have it, but React Native is still technically in beta. To get a fully functioning React Native app, you have to typically add some extra libraries like Redux for state management, Sagas for asynchronous calls and handling that. And also what happens usually is when you get pretty far into a complex interactions with an app, you end up having to write a lot of native code anyways to link into your JavaScript library. There's also some library compatibility issues depending on what version of JavaScript you're using and jQuery and so forth. There is no bugs. The other thing that people are kind of trying to figure out right now is there's a lot of competitors in Xamarin space of this JavaScript and native UI combination. There's NativeScript and Flutter. Flutter is actually fully released now. NativeScript is an Angular competitor to it. So there's some unknowns of whether it will take precedent over the other ones. My thoughts on the subject here. I think Xamarin is the overall winner currently. I think it's easy to build simple form applications as well as we can do Xamarin Native and do some more complex interactions. I think React Native is great for those who come in from a web background, but it's still not a solid, stable release, and it can be some difficult to maintain. React Native has a hot competitive space with NativeScript and Flutter and some other ones that are coming out. So it could easily be obsolete for next month, so forth. But I will say, when you do try to choose these, understand that current case as well as future. So plan ahead so you can reduce rewrites and get the best out of the chosen technology you choose.
Designing for cross-platform applications, obviously you have to keep in mind how you're going to create certain interactions across Android and iOS. Each of those UX standards varies, so it's important to consider each platform's users' expectations. What an iOS user expects to happen in certain interactions may not be the same thing as Android. You need to balance the consistency of branding and functionality with the conventions of the individual platform. So as you're designing, think about the brand and how it should function versus the conventions of the platforms and how you can join those together effectively. There's always the question of, should you strictly adhere to a platform's unique guidelines or make the apps as consistent as possible in appearance and functionality? You kind of want to toe that line and tread right in the middle with that and figure out with certain interactions what's more important, because obviously consistency is important, but you don't want to have an interaction that doesn't make sense to a certain user. Sometimes budget can be a decision factor, so that can rule out certain decisions for you or help make them easier to make. A few examples. This first one, is the Facebook app on the iPhone 6 and on the Pixels. There are a few sort of things I want to call out here as differences that the designer obviously considered. At the bottom of the iPhone 6, you can see the tab bar where there are the icons for navigation. If you look on the Pixel, that's been moved up to the top. One of the main reasons for that is the Pixel and other Android devices have that bottom menu bar that's always present. You want to separate those so that there's not any fat fingering going on where you're accidentally touching the wrong icons, touching the wrong buttons, and just separate those visually so there's not a bunch of clutter at the bottom of the screen. This example is with Messenger, and there are a few differences here. One of the main ones being if you look at the navigation bar at the bottom of the iPhone, we have that middle button, which is sort of the action button right in the middle. And we have that sort of same thing on the Pixel. But then if you look at how to start a new message, on the iPhone 6, you have up in the top right that little plus next to the search bar, which is generally a iOS norm. On Android, you have the Fab button there, that's the floating action button, and that is used for a primary action. So that's how you're going to start a message there. So those are separated out, and the reason for that is it's following the platform conventions. Next, we have within a message. The main thing I wanted to point out here was we have the light icons versus the dark icons. So on iOS, a lot of things are generally lighter feeling. They're whiter, lighter. Those icons aren't filled. They're really pretty faint, but distinguishable since there's not much else on the screen that's very heavy. Versus on the Pixel, those icons need to be heavier so that they stand out with things like the header bar that are dark colored and the bolder text and just more to compete with. They also, on the Pixel, swapped the position of the message, writing a message line and those icons. That reason for that is probably for the same reason as moving it to the top so that there's no fat fingering and touching the wrong icons, just separating those visually. This is just another example. This is Instagram, obviously, of the light icons versus the dark icons. At the bottom on the iPhone, you can see those icons are much lighter, much more airy feeling, and on the Pixel, they're a little darker. And you can also see that reflected in the header bar up there with the camera icon and the message icon. Here we have on Instagram, this is for adding a new post. One of the things I wanted to call out here was the switches on iOS for sharing to different social media platforms versus on the Android where we have the shorter list. The reason is Androids have a lot of different shapes and sizes versus iPhones. Some of those screens can get pretty small, so they obviously made that list shorter, have the 2 columns for each of those things so that you don't have to scroll when you're on smaller screens. And then they also took away those switches because that's generally an iOS convention. Also, you'll notice on the Pixel, they have the tabs up top for how you're going to share that. On the iPhone, they have this section that says new post with a little caret, and that will determine if you click on that who you're sharing it to, versus the Pixel has those tabs where clicking one of those tabs essentially is going to share to your followers or be a direct message. I'm not a huge fan of that convention. I feel like it's used a little bit weird, but it's an interesting way to do it, and it does use conventions of Android, so that's probably why they did it that way. This is an example of Yelp. One of the things I wanted to call out here that was interesting was the add button. So if you go to add a review on iPhone, it's pretty obvious where you're going to go, down on that middle tab bar. If you do it on the Pixel, if you notice it's not there. The reason why I think they did that was because putting a fab button might seem a little intense, because if you think about when you're using Yelp, how often are you really adding reviews? Not very often. So instead of putting a fab bar or a fab button, they chose to tuck it underneath the menu. You can see if you look at the Slideout menu, you have those 3 sections that say add a review, add a photo or video, or check in. On the iPhone, you can do those 3 things from pressing that plus button, so it just pops out into the check-in review or add photo, which is interesting that they prioritized it that way, but yeah, so they had the option to do the fab button on the Pixel, but instead they just chose to tuck it away. Rules to design by. It's important to get familiar with both platforms. I think it's good to get a device of each, so generally have an iOS device, whether it's a phone, whether it's a tablet of some sort, and then also have one for Android. Make sure you're well versed in familiar UX frameworks, generally such as material design. Those concepts are generally understood by both users, so those are some good medium designs to use. When you design for Android, make sure you consider the huge range of screen sizes, so they can range a lot more than iOS devices. You want to make sure your designs are going to fit on small screens as well as large. When you're going through this, there's always a question of, are you going to follow the guidelines exactly, or are you going to innovate on this UX feature? I would say the platform guidelines are recommendations, not necessarily law. So if you feel like you need to create a new experience for something to work, go for it. Just make sure you're checking in with your developer, making sure you are constantly figuring out the budget, figuring out the development time so that you're picking the best solution. What I always say is to constantly run informal user testing. So no matter what you're designing, whether it's cross-platform or not, make sure you're running user testing. That's especially true with cross-platform designs, just because you have more audiences to consider. Make sure people are seeing it and giving you constant feedback. But at the end of the day, the main goal is to focus on creating the best user experience for your customers. So whatever works best for them is generally the right answer.
Thank you for checking out our DeveloperTown MindMeld series. For more information or questions, you can reach us at info@developertown.com.